Good evening, everyone. This is a little bit unexpected. I wasn't planning to do a live stream this evening, and it is in response to the murder of David Amess, who's a member of Parliament in England. It is actually someone that I've met on a number of occasions. I wouldn't say I knew him really, but he's a very good man, very humble man, and in fact, I think the first time or so I met him, I didn't even realize that he was a member of Parliament. So he wasn't someone who bragged about what he did. But what I hear, and I haven't gone into the details much, is that he was stabbed by a 25-year-old, and the British government has labelled it an act of terrorism. And but beyond that, I haven't gone into the details. But I knew some of his family, but very sad. And as a result, I decided that I would do a video on the inevitable collapse of Islam, which I feel is a good response to it. The reason for the delay is Murad had given me a last-minute message saying that he had returned home, and so I've sent him a link, and I'm giving him a couple of minutes to join us if he's available. And obviously, once I start up the presentation, I may not be able to add him. So he hasn't responded back yet, so I presume he's not available. So in any case, I will get started. Let me start the presentation. Perhaps you could all just let me know that you can hear me okay before I get into it proper. And perhaps if I just check here that I can hear myself on the... can anyone hear me? Yeah, okay, great. That was fine. All right, let's get it cracking then. Okay, here we go. The inevitable collapse of Islam. You might think this is a bold statement, considering that it feels like Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. We're often told that, but very much like the little man syndrome, where a guy who's a little bit shorter than the average tends to boast about what a big guy he is. I think Islam is suffering from the same delusions. Now, it is true that Islam has been growing due to a very high birth rate, but that is no longer going to be the case in the not so distant future. And really, this is the theme of today. This is bringing together lots of different studies and so on. It's something that I've been meaning to do for quite some while, but today seemed like a very good occasion to do it. And I suppose I'm throwing down a warning to those who try to use violence to change the narrative. If I see any sort of terrorist attacks anywhere in the world like that, I will definitely be exposing the holes in the standard Islamic narrative. So please don't encourage me. I am well prepared to respond in my peaceful way by exposing more of the holes. So just letting our Muslim audience just realize that. Okay. Now, let me just carry on. So it's a few preliminary remarks. Christianity doesn't care about its numbers or its relative size, but in the truth of its message. Every committed Christian obviously would like to see everyone saved, but the point of Christianity isn't empire building, with the due exceptions given historically for Christendom and so on. But overall, Christians are not really worried about how many Christians there are in the world. It's not about empire building. The core thing is that there is a message that is either true or not, and there's an invitation there, not an imposition. and people can either choose to accept or reject. And that's really been the core of Christianity from day one. And any deviation from that, I think it'd be fair to say, is an aberration. And this is not just my opinion, but it's actually gospel-based, as we'll see in a moment. Jesus gave people the freedom to walk away, and this has been the practice too of Christianity. Christians don't barricade the doors to stop non-believers from escaping. You are always free to leave. Christianity is not Hotel California, as the song goes. You may enter, but you may never leave. It's not like that. Christians can, and in fact, ex-Christians can complain about just about anything to do with Christianity, but one thing they can't reasonably complain of is the fact that they've been blocked from leaving the religion. It's one of the freest religions in the world. You're free to leave. You generally speaking will not be treated badly if you leave. You may cause some upset in your family, but generally speaking, people respect your decision, and you are free to leave and also free to return. And this is all due to the idea that your free will is respected, your conscience is respected. And what's this based on? Well, it's based on the example of Jesus, which you can find in John's Gospel, chapter 6. We see Jesus allowed his disciples freedom to leave him. So just taking this passage then, on hearing it, and this is on hearing some of the teaching that Jesus was giving on the idea that he is the bread come down from heaven, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching, who can accept it?" Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you, they are full of the Spirit and life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them." From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Now notice it doesn't say, but Jesus raced after them and dragged them back. He didn't. It says, "You do not want to leave too, do you?" Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." So this is the model for Christians. I'd quite happily, agree that not every Christian has followed this, but I think the majority of Christians down through the centuries have followed the spirit of this, which is that Jesus has given us an example that if someone wants to leave Christianity, they're free to go, regardless of the consequences. And that's been the way. And I think that's something distinctive about Christianity that you don't find in Islam quite as much. Now, I would point out in the context of Islamic terrorism that violence is a sign of desperation. It's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of weakness. There have been tens of thousands of Islamic terrorist acts in the past 20 years alone. Not to mention, if we were to go back centuries before that, we could probably make an even bigger number. Many of these have been waged against those who no longer believe in Islam and who left the religion. Each act is a sign of desperation that their narrative has holes and is no longer convincing in a world where Islam has no control over what Muslims can see and hear. And this is largely, of course, due to the rise of the internet. It's no longer possible to control what books or programs or radio stations people see and hear. It's a new age that we live in. And as I say, this has led to a rising desperation to use terrorist acts, a bit like guard dogs trying to keep, or maybe shepherd dogs trying to keep the people corralled in their pens, but it's not working. People eventually lose their fear. Muslims are increasingly asking questions and seeing the holes in the standard Islamic narrative that they've been fed since they were children. And the old answers no longer work because we are not dealing with an ignorant population like in the past where people didn't know how to read or write. We're dealing with an increasingly educated population of Muslims. Many of them are doctors and nurses and so on, and working in fields of industry, engineering, you name it. And they have brains and they can think, and they are able to analyze and ask questions, and they can find the answers. And they may not always look to their imams for the answers. And this is why terrorism is often used as a corrective against that, to try and cow the population into submission. In relation to the idea that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, obviously we need to look at demographics, and to explore that, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what is the fertility rate? So the fertility rate is the average number of children per woman in a population, and that's the figure that's used to determine whether the population will grow over time or decrease or is static. So 2.1 is considered the replacement level. Anything below that figure leads to population decline. So that means that for every woman in the population, if they were to have 2 children, that would replace herself and her partner, her husband. Okay, now it's 2.1 because obviously not everyone has children, and also we have to take into account the fact that some people die before they reach adulthood. So that's why it's 2.1. But it's a good figure to keep in mind. So anything above 2.1 means the population is growing. Anything below 2.1 means it's decreasing. Now, if we take the US as an example, it might surprise you that back in the 1960s, the US fertility rate was much higher than it is now. Well, in fact, I'm sure most of you know that. It was actually 3.7 back in 1960. And as you can see, it fell to 1.7 in 2019. And as you can see, actually, since much of the 70s right through, it's been consistently below the replacement rate, which means that inevitably the population of the US will fall, at least its native population. The reason why we haven't seen the population actually fall per se is because of inward immigration, and also because there is a lag time. It takes time for a fall in the fertility rate to have an impact on the overall population. Okay, so interestingly, 3.7 is where it's at in 1960. That is actually higher than the fertility rate currently in Islamic majority countries. And it's worth bearing that in mind, especially when we're told how many children Muslim women are having. It's worth remembering that actually not so long ago, Western women were having similar numbers in their families. Now, if we compare that then to the Middle East and North Africa, it has experienced one of the fastest collapses of the fertility rate in the world. I say that again, one of the fastest collapses of the fertility rate in the world. This is something you never hear the Dawists ever mentioning. They always talk about how Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. It never tells you that Muslims have the fastest collapsing fertility rate in the world. This is no exaggeration. Have a look at 1960. It was nearly double what it was in the US. It's about 6.9, very close to 7. So in other words, the average woman had 7 children. Look at it in 2019, 2.7. That's a huge drop. So, in other words, it has fallen 4.2 from 6.9 to 2.7 children per woman on average. That's a huge drop, 4.2 children. So, in other words, the average woman in 2019 is having 4.2 less children than they would have back in 1960. And see how close now it is to the replacement rate. Okay, it's gone downwards consistently. It's not gone up at any stage. It's consistently falling. It doesn't take a genius to work out where it will eventually lead to. Okay, so the same factors that have led to the fall in the fertility rate in the West, even though it took a bit longer to impact the Middle East, it's still impacting the Middle East, and there's a little bit of a lag, but it's getting there. And if we take America's example, we had, if we just go back for a second, okay, so America was there, about 3.7, say, roughly in 1960, okay. Now, let me just see. So here it is when the North Africa and the Middle East were about the same. It was around the mid 1990s, we'll say 94, 95, around that time. That's when the Middle East and North Africa was at the same level as America. So back in 1960, America had the same fertility rate as the Middle East had in the 1990s. Now do the math. You can see that okay, the Middle East is 35 years behind, okay? But if you project forward, all things being equal, we should start to see similar replacement levels of a fertility rate in the Middle East very soon. So I think this confidence that Islam is the fastest growing in religion in the world is soon going to be replaced with a sort of despair. And I think there's many in power that realize what's happening and what the future holds. Hence why the sense of desperation and the big spike over the past 20 years in terrorism in an effort to try and turn back the inevitable. And this is pure just demographics. You can't make babies appear out of nowhere. Couples in the Middle East and North Africa are making different decisions about their family size than their parents would have made back in the 60s. They obviously realize that they can't afford as many children as it was possible in the past, and they are watching TV and they have aspirations for their own lives. They want to live a more middle class lifestyle. They want to be a little bit richer, and having many kids doesn't fit in with that. They're obviously watching soaps on TV. They are modeling their lives on those soaps and want to live that type of lifestyle. And also the fact that they have electricity now across the Middle East and North Africa, whereas 60 years ago that may not have been the case in everywhere. That's leading to a different situation where there are alternatives, ways of entertaining yourself in the evening, let's put it that way. And the same was true in Brazil. They found that in the 1970s, apart from the introduction of contraception, it was actually the introduction of electricity that also had a big impact in falling birth rates. So this is quite understandable. Okay. Now, looking at the trend, we can see that going forward, the trend is that eventually, as much as they may not like it, the fertility rate will eventually fall below the replacement rate. So what does that mean? It means that the average woman is having less children than than would replace herself and her partner, which means that over the population at large, eventually that's going to lead to a fall in the population. Okay, and if there's a fall in the population, inevitably that means a fall in the number of Muslims in the world. That's just plain demographics. There's nothing any preacher can do about that, apart from maybe encouraging women to have more children. But women are choosing for themselves how many children they want, and it's based on personal aspirations and things like financial needs and requirements and so on. So the Middle East and North Africa's average fertility rate will likely go below the replacement rate before the end of the decade. It's very close to it as it stands. So the next few years, it will head that way, and I don't see it being able to avoid the inevitable. And it's been that way in every part of the world where development has happened. So as countries get wealthier, inevitably their family sizes go down as people aspire to have a better lifestyle and so on. Now, there's a time lag with this. It will be decades before this leads to a collapse in the population of these countries. Now, maybe collapse in the population might be too dramatic, but if you look at how quickly the fertility rate has dropped from about 7 children per woman to 2.7 in the space of, well, from the 1960s to the 2020s, so you're talking about 60 years. So in the space of 60 years, it's dropped that much. I think it's realistic to talk about a collapse in the population, because if the trend continues for any length below the replacement rate, it's going to have a big knockdown effect. So in the meantime, in the short term, the population will continue to grow, but then there's going to be a point where it stops growing. Just to give you an example, the population of China, which has been famous as a country that had one of the largest populations in the world and growing very quickly and so on. But last year, China had more deaths than births. And this is set to continue for the decades to come as a consequence of its one-child policy decades ago. Even though they've got rid of the one-child policy, there simply is a lack of births, and you have an aging population. So inevitably, over the next few decades, China's population is going to collapse. It will eventually level off. But something similar will happen in the Middle East and North Africa as well, but it will be a few decades away. So the younger population will gradually replace the older population in the Middle East and North Africa. But what will be interesting to look at is, what will those younger people believe in? Will they believe in Islam? That's the question. Now, another thing to bear in mind is life expectancy. Life expectancy plays a part in how long before these trends take effect. So if we take the life expectancy in the United States, it's currently about 78.78 in terms of the most recent study there, 2019. So if we compare that to the Middle East and North Africa, it's 74.27. In other words, about 4.6 years lower in the Middle East and North Africa. So the lower life expectancy in the Middle East and North Africa means that falling birth rates will have an impact sooner than in the US. So it's going to mean that, all things being equal, the population will start collapsing in North Africa and the Middle East much quicker than it might do in the US. Now, the other thing to factor in as well is, while the US can boost up its population by ongoing inward immigration, the same is not true of the Middle East and North Africa. It is typically characterized by immigration. In other words, people leaving that area. And, people are desperate to leave the Middle East and North Africa. I wonder why. but they're going on their boats. They're taking dangerous journeys across the Mediterranean and so on. We're all familiar with those scenes. So they don't have that to keep the population up. They're not having people, by and large, come to their countries. So what's going to happen is the inevitable will happen is that the birth rates will continue to fall. You will increasingly have an older population, but with a lower life expectancy than what you would have in the US. So people will die sooner. And so that's inevitably going to lead to a fall in the overall populations in these countries in the decades to come, but much quicker than it's going to happen in the US. So what does this mean for the fastest growing by birth rate religion in the world? The world population of Muslims will inevitably reach a peak in the decades ahead, followed by a steep decline. And this doesn't take into account the rate of apostasy or Islam's relative success or failure at converting others to Islam. Now, I've been looking for the data on the relative success or failure at converting others between Islam and Christianity, and what I remember hearing before, and unfortunately I haven't been able to find it in time for this video, is that Christians typically are twice as successful as Muslims in converting others to their religion, but the numbers are relatively low in both cases. But so in terms of that whole battle, Christianity is twice as convincing, let's put it that way, than Muslims are in converting people to their religion. So the real strong trump card really for Islam at the moment was the high birth rate. It's kind of consoled itself with that, but as we can see, that's no longer going to be the case in the not so distant future. But what about the issue of apostasy? So that's the next thing I'm going to look at. As we can see here, the Middle East and North Africa are trying to hold back the inevitable tsunami of apostasy by the most draconian anti-blasphemy and anti-apostasy laws in the world. You can see these are the countries where those laws exist. And basically, what are these laws? These are basically barricade the exits strategies. It's basically, we will make it really difficult for people to leave Islam. We'll make it something that will frighten them from doing it. They may hide the fact that they've left Islam, but they won't be allowed to openly declare it, because they will be whipped, lashed, put into prison, or whatever else they might dream up to deter them. As you can tell, this is quite a difference from Christianity, where people are free to leave. So it's curious. And I would say that nothing says confidence in the tenets of one's religion like a plethora of apostasy laws. They clearly don't believe that Islam on its own has got enough on its own merits to convince people to stay within the religion. So this is why they have these laws. The fact that these laws exist is a pure sign that Islam has got a lot of holes that it's trying to cover up, because they feel that they need to block the exits. I think the best argument for leaving Islam is the fact that there are apostasy laws. It says it all. It says that the leaders have no confidence that their religion is attractive enough to keep people in the religion. They have to deter people by force. They have to block people from leaving by force in order to keep their numbers up. Now, so this is from a Pew research that was done a few years ago. A telling sign of the shaky state of Islam's future, many US Muslims consider Muhammad more essential than Allah's revelation. I thought this was incredible. Now, if you look at the statement here, percentage who say say blank, is essential to what being Muslim means to them. So 72% of US Muslims believe that loving Prophet Muhammad is essential to what being Muslim means to them, and yet following the Quran and the Sunnah is just 59%, which is incredible. So essentially, the revelation, supposedly from Allah, is less important by a fair margin than Muhammad. Does this sound like idolatry to you? It certainly sounds to me. This is just a human being, surely. But Muhammad seems to be more important to these Muslims than Allah himself and his revelation, which is no surprise, I'm sure, to many of you. I think it's even more stark if you look at the number for men. It's even 55%. 55% consider following the Quran and the Sunnah essential. And now, if we look down, you can see there's many other little factors going on. There's a 28% consider religion less important. So that's quite a surprising statistic. So 1 in 4 of Muslims in the US consider religion to be less important. Okay. Now, another area of interest would be obviously apostasy in Africa. And Africa is going to be a big focus for me for the next few weeks. I've seen many comments from people in West Africa and elsewhere asking for help. So, true to my word, I'm beginning today just to offer some support and help there. The following is a translation of the Al Jazeera interview between Maher Abdallah and Sheikh Ahmed Katani, talking about the issue of 6 million Muslims leaving Islam every year in Africa alone. I've left the link there that you can follow up and you can have a full read of this yourself. I'm just going to give you some extracts from the source. Now, I'm very curious about the name Maher Abdallah because there is an Irish name called Maher as well, if I'm not mistaken. It's very Irish sounding to me, but anyway, there might be some reason behind that. So he says, "Dear viewers, peace of Allah be upon you. Greetings and welcome to a new episode of the program Islamic Law and Life. Our topic this evening will be Christianization in the Dark Continent, Africa. For after Islam was the religion of the majority, the great majority of that continent, the number of Muslims now is no greater than 1/3 of the population. This is taken into consideration, of course, that a large portion of this group are Arab Muslims. So not only has the number of Muslims in Africa fallen, but of those that are Muslims, a large proportion of them are Arab. So they're not even native Africans, as it were, or at least ethnically native. No doubt that the missions of evangelization and Christianization played a great role in this demographic shift of Muslims in the continent." Sure did. Well done, Christians. Maher Abdallah says, "If we start by inquiring about your strict stance against the Christian missions in Africa, don't the followers of every religion have the right to seek new converts, exactly as you train and graduate young Muslims to propagate Islam?" Oh, there's a nice little question. So essentially, if the Muslim who's responding here says that Christians don't have the right, he could easily be accused of hypocrisy. So he's going to have to say, no, Christians do have the right. So, but he'll have to find a way to discredit the Christians in their work. And he, as you will see, he doesn't waste any time getting to that. And of course, he plays the victim card. So here's his response. "The question that you pose is a result of not comprehending the difference between the concept of Christianization and the concept of evangelism. The concept of evangelism is inviting the non-Christians to the Christian or Nazarene religion and this is the right of every Christian and the right of every believer to call others to his faith. However, we are talking about a different matter, which is Christianization. Christianization means the following: preparing plans and executing these plans and evolving these plans to change Muslims into Christians by taking advantage of the ignorance and poverty of the people and whatever necessitates from similar circumstances, as if Islam has never done that. So he goes on. So we are faced with the issue of taking advantage of circumstances, taking advantage of humanitarian needs, taking advantage of the lack of education, for example, that these people, missionaries, use to take Muslims out of their religion. Meher Abdallah says, fine, this is a big and dangerous phrase. Taking advantage of poverty, of ignorance, of lack of education, of some need is something that a Muslim can also be accused of. So if you don't back up what you say with examples, with references, your words remain in the air without much weight to them. Ahmed Al-Katani says, the reality is that these words say a lot less than they should. As we said in the beginning, everyone has the right to invite others to his religion. This is what is known as evangelism or proselytizing. As for Christianization, no one has the right to take Muslims out of their religion. And you ask for references, and the references are too numerous. So he's been very ambiguous with language here, I would say. I'm not clear exactly what the difference between proselytizing and Christianization. And I would suggest that evangelism and proselytizing are actually two distinct things. I think nowadays most of us would agree that proselytizing, which is converting people through unfair means, would be considered by most people a wrong method to use. People should be invited freely. They shouldn't be exploited in any way, regardless of what the religion is. But he's confusing the matter there a little bit, I would say. He goes on to say, Islam used to represent, as you previously mentioned, Africa's main religion. And there were 30 African languages that used to be written in Arabic script. The number of Muslims in Africa has diminished to 316 million, half of whom are Arabs in North Africa. So in the section of Africa that we're talking about, the non-Arab section, the number of Muslims does not exceed 150 million people. When we realize that the entire population of Africa is 1 billion people, we see that the number of Muslims has diminished greatly from what it was in the beginning of the last century. Hooray, hooray. On the other hand, the number of Catholics has increased from 1 million in 1902 to 329,882,000. Very precise figure, good man. Let us round off that number to 330 million in the year 2000. So here we have it. We can see that Islam is in a bad way in Africa. It's lost a huge amount of ground over the past 100 years, and it is not looking good for the next 100 years. Hence why we see day after day hundreds of cases around Africa of different terrorist attacks. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but certainly dozens of cases around Africa of terrorist attacks, because they're desperate. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to stem the flow. He goes on to say, as to how that happened, well, there are now 1.5 million churches whose congregations account for 46 million people. In every hour, 667 Muslims convert to Christianity. I wonder why it's 667 and not 666. Maybe he changed that number. Every day, 16,000 Muslims convert to Christianity. It's worth remembering that figure. 16,000 Muslims every day convert to Christianity. Every year, 6 million Muslims convert to Christianity. These numbers are very large indeed. And with every passing year, the situation of Islam gets weaker and weaker and weaker in Africa. And I think this is good news for all Christians in Africa. Keep up what you're doing. You're doing a great job. And eventually, these terrorist attacks will stop because there won't be any Islamic terrorists left to attack you, because eventually it'll be such a weak situation in Africa that they will have given up and admit defeat. I think these guys are already admitting defeat here. I think Africa is a lost cause, a lost cause even. Now, if we look at the US, the apostasy rate among Muslims is 23%. That's almost 1 in 4. So if you imagine there are 4 children in a family, one of them will leave Islam by the time they are in their 20s or 30s. And of course, the size of the family is reducing over time as well. But what about the Middle East? So let's have a look at the Middle East. We've looked at North Africa. We see the situation is pretty dire in the US. What's it like in the Middle East? So here's the source for this. It says, Middle East, are people losing their religion? Recent surveys indicate strongly that across the Middle East and Iran, almost half the population, that's a shocking statistic. Almost half the population is losing their ties to Islam. Governments have reacted differently to calls for reforms of institutional religion. Now, what's happening is that for decades, those in charge of Islamic governments have been excessively draconian, and they have basically killed off the faith of the people. They have led to people associating Islam with something really negative, a system of control that sucks the life out of their lives and doesn't offer them anything spiritual. It becomes just an ideological expression of the government, essentially. In a survey, 58% of Iranians said that they do not believe in the hijab altogether, while 72% oppose the compulsory hijab. So you can see there's a change in opinion on something as basic as the wearing of the hijab. Officially, Arab states have major Muslim populations, varying from around 60% in Lebanon to almost 100% in Jordan or Saudi Arabia. Since the country's religious establishments also serve as governmental bodies, governments play a significant role in religious life as they often control prayers, media, or school curriculums. However, several recently conducted and very comprehensive surveys in the Middle East and Iran have come to similar conclusions. They all show an increase in secularization and growing calls for reforms in religious political institutions. So what does that mean? Secularization simply means that people are becoming less religious. They are demanding a separation of church and state, or in this case, mosque and state. And they are looking for reforms in the political institutions. They want a liberalization of the country's laws. And obviously, if they liberalize the country's laws, people will be free to even more openly apostatize. So this is not a good situation for the governments in these countries, obviously. Now, if we take the case of Lebanon, the conclusion after 25,000 interviews in Lebanon by one of the largest pollsters in the region, the Arab Barometer, a research network at Princeton University and the University of Michigan, is personal piety has declined some 43% over the past decade. indicating that a quarter of the population now define themselves as religious. So indicating that less than a quarter of the population now define themselves as religious. Now, just bear in mind, a few days ago, there was significant terrorist attacks in Lebanon. Can you see the connection? Why are they attacking people in Lebanon at the minute? And these were attacks done by Shia Muslims against the Christian population, because they're frustrated that their religion is so weak and that so few people believe any longer. And so they're lashing out. They want it to be like the old days, but people no longer believe in what they're putting forward. So they use force. It's a good old way of trying to get your way. One Lebanese woman told DW of her experience growing up in a conservative household. I come from a very religious family. My parents forced me to wear the veil when I was only 12 years old, said the 27-year-old, who does not want her name published out of fear of reprisal. They constantly threatened me that if I remove my veil, I will burn in hell. Only years later at university, she met a group of friends who were atheists. I gradually became convinced of their beliefs. So one day, before going to uni, I decided to remove my veil and leave the house, she said. The hardest part was facing my family. Deep down, I was ashamed that I put my parents down. However, in Lebanon, it is almost impossible to not be officially linked to religion, as the civil registry includes the sectarian identity of every Lebanese citizen. Among the 18 options, non-religious is not listed. So you can't even put that down as a status when it comes to the census, which is very 1984. Now, the sad thing, I suppose, about what's happening in the Middle East is that so many people are turning to atheism. At least in my view, it's a sad situation. They have had such a bad experience of religion that they completely lose any sense of faith in God. That doesn't say much about Islam in those countries, that they have been successful in not only driving people out of Islam, but actually putting them off religion so much that they become atheists. That should maybe at the very least lead to the leaders in those countries questioning what they're doing. Why are they giving people such a bad experience of their religion that people not only are leaving, but they're stopping believing in God and becoming atheists? That says a lot. Now, if we take the case of Iran, and here, let's first of all look at the chart here on the right. How have your beliefs changed? And so the light blue is I've gone from being religious to non-religious. The dark blue is my belief faith has not changed much. I've become religious after being non-religious is the sort of orange. And the green is I've gone from one religious orientation to another. Now, what's most interesting among all the stats, if you look at the all, which is men and women, 47% have gone from being religious to non-religious. That's close to 50% of the Iranian population. In terms of men, it's higher. It's 50% among men, 43% among women. And the difference might be explained that maybe perhaps women were afraid to admit their loss of faith, even in a poll that was relatively safe because of fear of reprisals. So if we look into it further, like 6% have changed their religious affiliation, which could mean anything, but it could potentially mean that 3%, we'll take half, 3% may have changed from Islam to, say, Christianity. So that would bring us up to 50% if we're fair in supposing that. And there's certainly lots of anecdotal evidence that a lot of people are converting to Christianity. But if you look at the younger generation, if the 20 to 29-year-olds, this is the hope of Iran, the hope of Islam. In that age bracket, 52% have gone from being religious to non-religious. Now, they either were never religious in their childhood because they just didn't believe it, or they started asking questions as teenagers and eventually lost faith. These millennials are able to access, various websites around the world. They are an educated population. They can, in many cases, can speak other languages like English and French and so on, and so can access information from around the world. And they're deciding that Islam is not for them. And it's not much better among the 30 to 49 age group. That's 46%. It's a little bit better in the 50 plus age group. But that age group will eventually become 60s. They will eventually get to the age of 60 and 70 and 80 and will eventually die off. So it's the younger generation that's of most significance. What happens when we run the clock forward and generation after generation are like these 20 to 29-year-olds, where more than half have given up on Islam? You eventually have a situation where the majority of the population will inevitably be not Muslims. How do the mullahs suppose that they can hold on to power in that situation? Are they going to be using violence and hold power as a minority? I think that's not sustainable in the long run. I think eventually that's going to backfire, because the more that they do that, the more people will actually become non-religious. So it's actually going to feed the monster that they are trying to avoid. So it's not looking good for Iran. It's a lose-lose situation for them in terms of, for the Islamic leaders. If they liberalize, it's only going to lead to more people leaving the religion. If they become more draconian, that's inevitably going to alienate more people. So either way, they're not going to be able to turn this around. I think people have had too long a bad experience of Islam for it to be turned around. They can't fake it any longer. People have experienced it. The lies don't work. Now, a little bit further into that, among 40,000 interviewees by the Group for Analyzing and Measuring Attitudes in Iran, which research Iranians' attitudes towards religion, found that no less than 47% reported having transitioned from being religious to non-religious. Pouyan Tamimi Arab, assistant professor of religious studies at Utrecht University and co-author of the survey, sees this transition, as well as the quest for religious change, as a logical consequence of Iran's secularization. The Iranian society has undergone huge transformations, such as the literacy rate has gone up spectacularly, the country has experienced massive urbanization, economic changes have affected traditional family structures, the internet penetration rate grew to be comparable with the European Union, and fertility rates dropped, Tamimi Arab told GW. Isn't it interesting that when literacy rates goes up, religious belief in Islam goes down? I wonder why that is. Would it have anything to do with the fact that Muslims can read the Quran for the first time and not like what they read? Or maybe do a bit of research and find out their local imam, has been lying to them? It might have something to do with that. Compared with Iran's 99.5% Shiite census figure, GAMAAN, quite a mouthful there, or Gaman, found that 78% of the participants believed in God, but only 32% identified themselves as Shiite Muslims. So the survey found that 32% identified themselves as Shiite Muslims, whereas the official census, 99.5%, put put themselves down as Shiite Muslims, obviously fearing retaliation if they admit to not being a Shiite Muslim. Figures show that 9% identified as atheist, 8% as Zoroastrian, 7% as spiritual, 6% as agnostic, and 5% as Sunni Muslim. Around 22% identified with none of these religions. Now, this quote here suggests that Islam is rejected, not God. We see an increase in secularization and a diversity of faiths and beliefs, Tamimi Arab told DW. From his point of view, however, the most decisive factor is the entanglement of state and religion, which has caused the population to resent institutional religion, even as the overwhelming majority still believes in God. So, the experiment with theocracy in Iran has been an abject failure. I think that's a fair thing to say. It has done the opposite of what they expected. It has led to people just losing their religion. The sociologist Ronald Inglehart, Lowenstein Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the University of Michigan and author of the book Religious Sudden Decline, has analysed surveys of more than 100 countries carried out from 1981 to 2020. Inglehart has observed that rapid secularization is not unique to a single country in the Middle East. The rise of the so-called nones, which refers to people who belong to no religion, who do not identify with a particular faith, has been noted in Muslim-majority countries as different as Iraq, Tunisia, and Morocco, Tamimi Arab added. Dorsey, an expert on the region, highlights two contrasting examples. While the United Arab Emirates has lifted the bans on alcohol consumption and unmarried couples living together, Saudi Arabia has labelled having atheist thoughts as a form of terrorism, which is a crazy idea. So that's as totalitarian as you can get there. As an example, Dorsey references Saudi dissident and activist Raif Badawi, who was convicted of apostasy or insulting Islam. Badawi was sentenced to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes for questioning why Saudis are obliged to adhere to Islam and asserting that religion did not have the answers to all of life's questions. I would argue that just questioning Islam is not a crime. Dare I say it? It's a reasonable thing for any human being to do. And in fact, I would say it's an obligation on anyone with a mature religious faith. There's an obligation to question everything. And if you can survive all that and still have a faith, then great. But if you don't question it, what are you but a brainwashed fool? But in any case, let's see what the punishment there for him was. Now, this analysis doesn't take into account the accumulative effect of the historical critique. The historical critique, as it has been expressed through the internet, has really been just a recent phenomenon. Obviously, there's the more academic side of things, which has been going on for a good 2 centuries, but that's been just known about in academic circles, not really had any major impact beyond that. But a number of channels have been exposing the holes in the standard Islamic narrative, such as Sneakers Corner, I wonder who they are, Fander Films, Sira International, DCCI Ministries, Islam Critiqued, Soko Films, Lloyd de Young, Islamic Clarity, Islam Research Group, which is Paul's new channel, if you're not familiar, Paul Ellis's. And then we have Odin Lafontaine's channel, which I believe is called Odin Lafontaine, if I'm not mistaken, but it might also be called The Great Secret of Islam. I'm not sure. I'll have to double check. And there are many, many more. There are hundreds of similar channels across North Africa, the Middle East, and in India. And I don't know even the full extent of what's out there. There's certainly dozens and dozens of them. And there are new ones starting every day. So there are channels with just 100 subscribers to hundreds to thousands, and they're all having an impact. Together, we are asking questions that Islam can't answer, and it is having an effect. More and more Muslims are coming to realize that they have been lied to since childhood. And the Dawists try to reassure them by adding even more lies, just confirming that they were lied to begin with. So the lies are no longer working. People have access to information that they weren't able to access before, and all of these channels and more, and all the various other websites that are there across the internet. Collectively, we're all making a difference, each of us making a small little difference, but it's becoming more and more possible for Muslims to find out truthful information. Okay, not everything that's been put out there is correct, because a lot of this depends on sort of evidence that isn't 100% because of the destruction of evidence down through the centuries. But by and large, when you put all the evidence together, you see a clear picture of a religion that has constantly changed the narrative, tried to cover up holes, and basically destroy any evidence that contradicts its general narrative. So my forecast, which is a bold one, if we assume that the claim that there are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, if that's true, which I very much doubt, considering the reality of places like Iran, where perhaps as many as 50% have left Islam. But even if we assume that that figure is true, what I forecast is that the religion will continue to grow up to about 2030, and then through a series of reasons, it will collapse going forward, all the way to 2060 and onwards. And I actually think it will keep going downwards on a perpetual downward trajectory due to a number of factors. A general fall in population, apostasy on levels that have not been seen before, and the fact that the wider world will have changed so much that it will put pressures on Islam to change and reform that will expose how draconian it has been in the past, and it will try to adapt and change and try and be a bit friendlier, but it won't work. And so I think what Islam is facing is similar to what affected Christianity in the 19th century, when there was a double whammy of the historical critique on the Bible, plus things like the theory of evolution. It led to a lot of people abandoning Christianity, rightly or wrongly. And that's had an impact to this day. And the increased secularization is also going to have a massive impact. So I think we could be seeing a future where by the end of the 21st century, we could have a population of Muslims which are around the 200 to 300 million bracket. So roughly about the size of the Orthodox Christianity. So not completely decimated, but, a shadow of what it used to be. So that's my prediction. The work of this channel is devoted to making that happen. And just on that score, anyone who emails me, sneakerscorner3@gmail.com, and who wants a copy of this PowerPoint, I will be more than happy for you to have it, and you can use it on your own channel, translate it, feel free. It's there for you. And so Let's make it happen. So in conclusion, in absolute terms, the population of people living in North Africa and the Middle East will peak and then decline. The trend in North Africa is that the numbers of Muslim adherents will continue to decline, and Muslims will increasingly convert to Christianity. In the Middle East, a sizable percentage of the under 40s have stopped believing in Islam. Falling fertility rates coupled with widespread apostasy will see a collapse in the numbers of Muslims, both in relative and absolute terms, over the coming 30 years and beyond. Secularization will inevitably lead to the abolition of apostasy laws, which in turn will speed up the rate of apostasy as more ex-Muslims come out into the open. Meanwhile, Islam's masters will continue to have a tantrum in the face of the inevitable decline of Islam, mainly through terrorism and show trials of those who dare leave the religion. And there I leave it, and I'll come back to you in the chat. Now, hello to all of you. So it's, I know many of you will be thinking, well, Christianity is going through a similar situation. I'm hopeful for Christianity. Christianity is built around resurrection, and it's part and parcel of Christianity to go through cycles. And but Islam doesn't have that. Islam is a religion of triumphalism, and it doesn't do well when it's on the losing side. And this is a weak point. This is something that Murad has often mentioned. Muslims don't like hearing stories of failures in the past or currently. So that's it. I don't know if anyone has any comments they would like to make. Now is a good time to mention those, and I can include them in the chat. Christianity has facts. Islam is gossip, hearsay. Very good. Yes, true. Mel, Murad, and Sneakers Corner. Thank you, brother. Blessings of Christ upon your ministry in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you very much. Repent. I hope Jay does a lecture on this in a packed out church. I have actually sent a message to Jay, and I've offered to send him this. I'm sure he could quite happily turn this into an amazing presentation, and I'm sure he can add to this. But I think this would be great to get out there, and I encourage you to share this far and wide. I've been holding back on this one because, but why hold back if they want to start using violence? Well, let's use peaceful means and show up the nonsense. As an Yazidi Kurd myself, we've completely rejected the cult of Islam from the beginning till now. From this type of programs, as much as informed is entertaining for me. I'm delighted, and I often get my hair cut with Kurds. I think the Kurds are great, and delighted to hear from you. I'd love to actually have some Kurds come on the channel at some stage, though. If any of you would like to just send me an email, I'd be more than happy. Kafir, Linda, let's get her done. Family, destroying Islam, one truth at a time. That's the spirit. Archaeology is also a big killer of falsehood going forward. Absolutely. I'm sure you've all watched Odin's videos on Fander Films lately, and he makes a fantastic case using the coins. Thanks, Mel. This was very good. Jesus will return soon. Let's pray Muslims find Jesus soon. Absolutely agree with you there. And Faye says, I just joined, so I think I'll watch from the beginning, but from experience, living with Christians is far more forgiving than living with Muslims. Yeah. Islam has Abdul facts from the leader, Liar Mo. Very good. Now, hello to Ali McLean. Christianity has historical facts to back up that Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. No other belief system, including atheism on earth, has that level of facts to back it up. And much love, brother. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Iraqi Kurdistan has a Kurdistan church. Yeah. Anyway, that's it for today. It's great to see so many of you. 115 watching, which is fantastic. Absolutely delighted. This is, as I say, was an impromptu presentation. I'm delighted I actually did this really because I feel it was appropriate considering that attack there on Friday or yesterday. Yeah, we must do this again sometime. Let's get the word out, and let's try and get that curve heading downwards. We do historical critiques, but we're not completely neutral on terms of what we would like to see happen. We don't think that Islam is a force for good in the world. We try and we do our research fairly, nonetheless. But at the end of the day, we think that, and we say we, referring to myself and Murad, we think it would be far better for people to know the truth and get out of a brainwashing cult. Now, last comment from Vilnius. Good time for me. Mostly stuff is on when I'm asleep. Well, I'm delighted that it's on a time that suits you there. And with that, I'll say good night to all of you and talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.